Architectural Outcast.
Welcome to the Architectural Outcast architectural jury critiquing the architecture of Crimson Desert. I'm Randy, your juror for this critique. This time around, we're looking at the architecture of South Hernand, beginning with the little fishing village of Vellua. The first time I wandered into Vellua, my immediate reaction was, oh, I know what inspired this. Jeju Island. Full disclosure, I spent my honeymoon on Jeju Island. It's a little island off the southern coast of Korea. I love that little island. Its architecture, its landscape, its food. If you all find yourself there, I can't recommend the abalone porridge enough. Jeju Island is famous for its dry-fit black stone walls, low squat houses with thatched roofs, sea-based economy, and a long history with piracy. Both sides of that equation. And what do we find when we first hit Vellua? Dry-fit black stone walls, low squat stone houses with thatched roofs. The only thing missing are the nets to hold the thatch on from the ocean winds. Vellua's a fishing village, and one of the storylines revolves around fighting off pirates. So sea economy and pirates, check. Even Vellua's landscape, a little coastal valley surrounded by rugged cliffs and dramatic waterfalls, is right out of the Jeju playbook. However, the developers didn't just copy a Jeju village one-to-one. They took it as baseline inspiration and then added their own embellishments. They added the tall, raised elements to the centers of the thatched roofs, giving Vellua its unique character. I gotta say though, this is another example of style over substance. Yes, these style of roofs do exist in East Asia, and they serve a purpose, particularly in homes that have an open fire pit. It raises the thatch roof up away from the heat, thus avoiding fires, and the raised up area acts as a chimney, pulling the smoke up and out of the areas where people live. However, this style of roof makes absolutely no sense in a place where you have strong ocean winds. The roof becomes a giant sail. Every time there's a storm, the winds would be trying to rip the roof off the house.
Oh, come on, Randy. Aren't you being a bit pedantic here? Don't you remember the rule of cool? Pearl Abyss wanted to make Vellua feel unique and special. The roofs accomplished that. And there aren't really any sea breezes, so why does it matter?
This is why I always say, if you're gonna mess around with symbolism, you better know what you're doing. Pearl Abyss was doing something smart here, giving their architecture depth and a sense of history, of connectedness. But in doing so, they created a whole nother problem. When you come rolling up on the capital of the kingdom of Demonis, lo and behold, what do you discover? High-pitched hip roofs, exactly like you find in Vellua. Now, there are a number of things going on here. One of them is that in Paiwo, the further east you go, the more advanced the civilizations become. One interpretation is that the Western, less advanced civilizations are mimicking the Eastern, more advanced architecture without understanding that architecture's function, purpose, or even reason for existing in the first place. And that their desire to copy this architecture is so great, it outweighs all practical considerations. Like every time it storms, they'll lose their roof. If that's the story that Pearl Abyss is trying to tell, then that's the story Pearl Abyss is trying to tell. I'm not in the business of making, why didn't you do something else type criticism. But there's still a problem with that storytelling. That's not the way architecture works. The classic example, pun intended, are Greek and Roman architecture. The Greek temple, with its pediments, triglyphs, friezes, columns, is the preservation of a more primitive architecture in a stone form. Early Greek religion revolved around placing statues within sacred groves of trees. Later, they'd put the statue inside a simple wood structure in those sacred groves. The grand Greek temple that we're all familiar with today is symbolic of that humble shack in the middle of a grove of trees. And all the decorative elements, the triglyphs, the frieze, the pediments, are preserving the memory of the wood structure of that humble little shack. When the Romans first appeared on the scene, they were farmers. They were hicks, rubes, hillbillies living on the edge of the civilized world. When they first encountered Greek architecture, they got the symbolism. That's the whole point of architecture, to communicate. They understood what the Greeks were saying, and they liked what they were hearing. But the Romans didn't just blindly copy what the Greeks were doing. They interpreted it within their own cultural context and then adapted it to their own cultural needs. The Greeks used architecture to preserve their history. The Romans used architecture to preserve history as how they wanted to remember it. So this assumption that lesser cultures blindly copy more advanced cultures without understanding what they're doing doesn't play out historically. It's much more complicated than that. The next question we need to ask, what do these steep-pitched hip roofs communicate? What purpose do they serve? Why would somebody go through all the effort to build these things? Because from personal experience, these things are a pain to build. Historically, we find these types of roofs primarily in two climates. Either in a climate with lots of precipitation, rain or snow, the steep roof drains lots of water quickly and prevents snow from building up, or we find these roofs in very hot climates. They help pull the heat up and away from the living areas. Demonis has a moderate climate. It's the breadbasket of Pywell. It doesn't have extremes in precipitation and heat. So while the roofs do work in this climate, they're a bit of a mismatch. This isn't the ideal roof style for this type of climate. This indicates it's a cultural preference. They just like this style of roof. There's another interesting clue as to what might be going on here. Y'all will notice there's another common type of roof to be found throughout Demonis. The low hip roof. We head back to Vellua, and lo and behold, what do we discover? The same low hip roof. And wouldn't you know it, low squat houses with low hip roofs fit Vellua's environment perfectly. This makes sense after all, as Vellua and its environment is at least partially inspired by a real-world example, the architecture and environment of Jeju Island. Returning to the city of Hernand, and what do we find? The same low-pitched hip roofs, but this time around, they're intermixed with traditional gable roofs. Here's where things start to get interesting. Hernand city's environment is inspired by Tuscany, Mediterranean leaning into southern Alpine. And you find these types of roofs all over Tuscany. So clearly, the roof fits the environment. A lot of other houses in the city have the more traditional gable end roof. And these traditional gable roofs work just fine in this climate. And they're easier and simpler to build, requiring less skill and less materials than hip roofs. Clearly, there's another cultural preference here. They like these roofs enough to put the time and effort and money and materials into building them. So when we come bebopping into Payloon, what do we find? No hip roofs. Lots of gable roofs, very steep gable roofs, but no hip roofs. This is another interesting point. In all the places that I've explored so far in these critiques, Payloon is the one place where it would make perfect sense to have a high, steep hip roof. Northern climate with lots of snow. But yet, we don't find it. They went with steep traditional gable roofs. That means the hip roof, both the tall and low, aren't universal across Pywell. And yet, we find it in 3 diverse cultures where the hip roof isn't the ideal, particularly the tall one. And where we do find the hip roof, Its situation is complicated. In Vellua, a thatched, low hip roof makes perfect sense, a la Jeju Island. Whereas, like I said earlier, that tall hip roof is just silly. In Dimonus, a slate hip roof, both tall and short, works, but it's not ideal for the climate. It's not optimized for its environment. And then on top of that, we're starting to see the introduction of gable roofs. And then in Hernand, where the environment would make the most sense to have a tall hip roof, it's not even there. And the low hip roof is starting to be crowded out by the gable roof. The architecture isn't telling a story of a less advanced, inferior culture blindly mimicking a more advanced, superior culture. Instead, the architecture is telling us that Vellua, Dimonus, and Hernand have a shared history, a shared past. In fact, they all might be descendant of the same older civilization, and that these hip roofs are cultural memories of that shared past. And in Vellua, those cultural memories have survived much more intact than in Dimonus and even Hernand. And this makes perfect sense. The architecture of small cities and towns tends to be more conservative, more resistant to change. The older styles and cultural memories tend to last longer, thus being preserved. As I keep saying, Pearl Abyss has done something smart here. The architecture tells us that Pywell has a past, a complicated history, indicating that this world doesn't just exist for the benefit of the player. Instead, we have a feeling that we've stumbled into the middle of something, further increasing immersion. Back to Vellua and these tall hip roofs that don't fit their environment. If these roofs are cultural memories that have become so important that they outweigh practical considerations, you would not expect to find these roofs on top of sheds, outbuildings, and workshops. That would be for the simple reason, not only do you have to worry about losing your roof every time there's a strong breeze, you would risk losing everything under the roof. What you would expect is to find that type of roof on a symbolically important building, culturally or religious, and then steps taken to prevent that roof from going sailing off every time you have a stiff breeze. But the church is low and squat, with a low hip roof, and even the steeple is low and squat, perfectly fitting its environment. Pearl Abyss almost gets it right. They have a village, Vellua, at least partially inspired by a real-world example, Jeju Island, whose architecture fits its environment perfectly, again inspired by a real-world example, Jeju Island. There are architectural elements in Vellua that we find elsewhere in Pywell, which again, the whole history thing. One of those elements doesn't fit the environment. And again, it could have worked, but they put it on the wrong building.
Okay, it's the wrong roof. We get it, Randy. Why are you yammering on and on about this?
That's why I keep going back to, if you're going to mess around with symbolism, you better know what you're doing. Architecture in the real world is limited by reality, physics, gravity, strength of materials, weather conditions. You don't get those right, your building stops existing, sometimes with tragic consequences. However, in fiction, there's a conundrum, a little paradox that every creator, every world builder has to navigate. In fiction, movies, TV shows, novels, video games, there are no physics. Or more precisely, the physics, the environment, the weather are what you say they are. So they can't cause the architecture to collapse unless you say they do. So in theory, you can design the architecture to be whatever you want. There are no structural, physical limitations on what it can be. And here's where the conundrum starts to kick in. Architecture is symbolic. It communicates. And one of the most important things that it communicates is how it interacts with and reacts to its environment. So when we find an architectural element that violates the rules of its environment, it's communicating. And in this case, the symbolism is actively undermining the storytelling, breaking immersion. In this case, it's a result of Pearl Abyss otherwise doing such a good job. Within the narrative, the people of Vellua have done such a good job designing their village to perfectly fit within its environment that it's not believable that they would make such a mistake for whatever reason involving those high hip roofs. Therefore, it has to be a design mistake. And the last thing a world builder wants is for the audience to start questioning design decisions. At any rate, moving on. I love Vellua's church. Low, squat, tucked in on a hillside, protected from the ocean, made out of the same materials as the rest of the village, but just on a slightly larger scale. Really well done. However, there are two problems. First one is a really easy fix. They show the church having no doors and no windows. This makes no sense considering all the fragile, valuable stuff that they show inside the church. It would all fade, disintegrate, rot within months. As I said, this is an easy fix. Just put doors and windows on the building. You say you're worried that such a small village couldn't afford glass windows in their church? Okay, valid concern. Then just put shutters on the windows. When the building's in use, you open the windows to let in light and fresh air. And then when it's not, you close it up to protect all that stuff. The second problem is structural. More precisely, the building has two redundant structures, which end up making both of them impractical. The building has a simple post and beam structure holding up the thatched roof. And there's nothing wrong with it. There's lots of real-world examples of basically this structure. The problem is with the infill, the sections of wall in between the posts. They're plaster-covered stone. No one builds like this, because if you have the ability to make a stone wall, you make the whole wall out of stone. You then set the wood roof on top of that wall. Stone walls are stronger than wood columns, so you gain nothing by having the wood columns. And to make matters worse, inserting the wood columns breaks up the wall, further destroying its structural integrity as well. When the wood columns start to rot, not only do you have to replace the wood columns, you have to rip out the stone walls to be able to replace the wood columns. This is another example of close but no cigar. If you would have had walls with a wattle and daub infill, woven branches covered in mud and then plaster, or even mud bricks covered in plaster, it would have been perfect. As it stands, the church isn't really one thing, and it's not really another. And it can't exist as shown. One of the things I'm going to keep harping on in these critiques is all of the random stuff just piled up everywhere. And like so much that I keep pointing out, there's a lot of smart, clever ideas with this, which is then immediately undermined and contradicted. There are goods piled up on the beach and the docks, giving us the impression that they've just been offloaded from a ship, or they're waiting for the next ship to arrive to be shipped out. We have stuff piled on and around a loading dock next to what looks like a warehouse. There are piles of firewood stacked up outside of homes and businesses, looking like they've just been delivered. There are even wheelbarrows left in the middle of fields, giving the impression that somebody was busy at work when they suddenly got called away. All this gives the impression that the players walked into the middle of something ongoing, of a vibrant, dynamic community engaged in all sorts of activities. There are even little sheds to store odds and ends on the edges of fields, which you do find in traditional farms around the world. And then you have crap like this. You stop giving the feeling of someone being called away from a piece of equipment, and replace it with a sense of abandonment. First off, you would never abandon something like this in the middle of a field. If for nothing else, you've now just given a home for vermin. You know, the things that destroy crops. But then there's the bigger picture. If there's just stuff abandoned everywhere, it actively undermines the symbolism and message of the stuff that was placed there intentionally. It gets lost in the wash. And then there's the problem that there's no rhyme or reason most of the stuff is placed where it's placed. For instance, why would all this stuff be piled up next to the church? Not only will all of this rot out in the weather, why didn't they put it under the covering instead of on it? You've now again provided a home for vermin and easy access for them to get up into the thatch of your roof, which they will destroy, which will cause your church to leak like a sieve. Speaking of, you never leave piles of hay out in the weather long enough for bushes to grow up in and around them. Again, you're just giving a free home for vermin. There's a second, even bigger problem. Wet hay can self-combust. You leave this much hay out in the weather next to buildings, and you risk burning the whole town to the ground. You know, the same town that makes its roofs out of hay? This gets to one of the most glaring architectural oversights in Vellua. There are no barns. There should be no reason for all of this hay to be just out there in the weather. What buildings they do have are way too small, and you don't put haystacks in barns. We're back to symbolism. You put the right amount of stuff in the right places, and Vellua feels like it's an active, vibrant, busy place, like you've walked into the middle of something. Too much stuff, and you start to dilute your message. Things become chaotic and nonsensical. And then when you put the wrong things in the wrong places, and then just leave things laying everywhere, you now send the message that the people of Vellua are either too stupid or too lazy to pick up after themselves and to put things where they belong, turning Vellua into one giant fire trap. One of the cool things about Sunset Valley is you get the sense of a small farming village struggling to survive in a clearing in the middle of a primeval forest. This is tapping into our ancient cultural memories of the origins of human civilization. The architecture isn't proud and self-confident. On the contrary, it's timid and almost frightened. The buildings are small and low, huddled together as if for security, as if they're afraid of what lurks in the forest that surrounds them. The buildings in Sunset Valley are similar to size, shape, and use as we encountered in Vellua, complete with thatched roofs, indicating a shared building culture. However, instead of being made from stone, these buildings are timber frame construction with wattle and daub infill, which makes perfect sense for a village located in the middle of a forest. And for those of y'all who want to know what the heck is wattle and daub infill, here's an example of it being built. Flexible, thin branches being woven together and then covered with clay to create a solid wall. The first time I came rolling into Sunset Valley, I was immediately reminded of Kariko Village from Breath of the Wild, a fascinating blend of English and Japanese rural village architecture. Sunset Valley is a wonderful example of the Asian aesthetic and philosophy of blending the built environment in with nature. There's this sense that the village has grown out of the environment, giving the impression that it's outside of time, that it has always been here and will always be here. Getting back to stuff everywhere, one of the interesting things is that we find here in Sunset Valley, there isn't a lot of stuff just laying around, which muddies the waters of the storytelling, both architecturally and narratively. According to the story, Sunset Valley is a poor, isolated village where the residents are up to all sorts of naughty stuff. So if they're poor, it would make sense they just don't have the stuff to leave it laying around. Sunset Valley is full of villains up to all sorts of naughtiness, but yet their village is beautifully designed to integrate within nature and is neat and tidy. Whereas Vellua is full of stupid people incapable of turning their village into a fire trap. So who are the baddies again? And that brings up one last aspect of the symbolism of Sunset Valley. Beautifully designed, neat and tidy rural village, clearly inspired by Japanese architecture, yet full of sneaky villains. So what are Korean developers trying to say here? I gotta say, I love the touch of these little huts with the raised floors used for drying and preserving food. You find them all over Korea and Japan, the whole world for that matter. On to Scholastone, where there are two components, the Institute itself and then the support community around it. The Institute is pretty good. The support community, we start to see a theme of some similar problems. Scholastone is supposed to be an ancient institute where a bunch of disconnected brainiacs preserve knowledge and delve into the secrets of the universe. Pearl Abyss does this with the architecture by tapping into our preconceived notions. It uses the classical orders of Greece and Rome because we associate Greece and Rome with ancient wisdom, but then it modifies it. Greece and Rome very rarely, if ever, use square columns and capitals to create something that is both familiar and alien. To further indicate a sense of age, as well as faded glory, as a culture in decline, holding on despite the world falling apart around them, Scholastone is shown as being in partial ruin. This is a case where it makes sense to show stuff being left where it fell. Scholastone's ancientness is further reinforced by the centuries and generations of wear of all the feet going up and down the stairs. Putting books into chambers carved into the side of the mountain makes sense, because that's what we do today with all the fragile stuff we want to preserve. I gotta say, no institute that worships knowledge the way we're told Scholastone does would allow books to be left laying higgledy-piggledy all over the floor. Another nice touch is how you have all these conduits, pipes, and lines running throughout the building. Scholastone might be ancient and faded, but these conduits and pipes give the sense that it's still dynamic and alive. One of the real drawbacks to building inside a stone mountain makes it hard to modify things. Typical academic solution? Just put the upgrades wherever, even if you have to step over them. Doesn't matter. Going back to architectural symbolism, it takes a lot of time, effort, skill, and most importantly, economic capital to carve into the side of a mountain. And then to make the spaces as grand and as ornate as they are. The culture who built Scholastone placed a lot of importance on knowledge, and they want you to know it. And then the spaces for the staff and faculty, not only are they grand, they're lovely. Fancy schmancy dining halls, grottos for lectures, elegant rooftop gardens for quiet contemplation and socialization. Scholastone as a whole is artistically laid out and aesthetically pleasing, indicating that the people that use this space have a very high social status, as faded as it might have become. This brings us to the community outside of Scholastone, its support structure. And here we go again. Simply put, it doesn't fit the aesthetic and the symbolism of the Institute. It's a dump. Now, I know the story that they're trying to tell. The elites up on the hill and the peasants down in the valley. And again, we have the whole faded glory thing. And the narrative tells us that Scholastone has been cut off from the outside world here relatively recently. What they fail to understand is by making the surrounding community a dump, they actively undermine the symbolism that they created with the Institute. To understand the point I'm trying to make here, all you need to look at is Cambridge, Frankfurt, Kyoto, the historic universities in Seoul. These places were where the greatest minds of their time went to study, to learn, to create new knowledge. They were the elite of the elite, and everything about them, including the support structures, were the elite of the elite. The town that you went through to get to the university represented the elite status of the university. They often had laws and ordinances requiring buildings to be maintained to a certain standard. They had sanitation and sewer systems. They even had people whose job it was to run around and keep the streets clean. The medieval monasteries of Europe, who are credited with help keeping knowledge alive, and part of their elite status came from their access and control to that knowledge, were described as having the best quality buildings with the highest standard of living of anybody else around them. And that meant from the abbot all the way down to the newest lay brother. And yes, the abbot ate fancier grub, wore fancier threads, and lived in a fancier pad than your average lay brother. But you all see, elite status wasn't just dependent upon yourself. It was also dependent upon the people who represented you, particularly the support staff that allowed you to pursue knowledge. That means a culture that would take the time, resources, and wherewithal to design and then build Scholastone would have also taken the same time, wherewithal, and resources to build the architecture to house the support structure that would have made Scholastone possible in the first place. Even if it wasn't as grand as Scholastone, it wouldn't have been a dump. Furthermore, Scholastone conveys this sense of age. Yeah, it's faded, but it feels like it's almost as old as the mountain itself. Whereas whatever this is around it feels like a refugee community thrown up 6 months ago out of whatever garbage they happened to round up at the time. This is where I'm going to wrap things up. Next on our grand tour of the architecture of Paiwel, we're going north to frigid Payloon. At any rate, I hope I gave you all something to think about, and until next time, y'all be safe. If y'all enjoy this type of content, exploring architecture in all its forms, consider liking this video, subscribing to the Architectural Outcast, clicking that notification bell. You can hear me yammer on about something else next time, and feel free to share this video far and wide.
Please like and subscribe. Please leave a comment.